The wind that swept across the Mount of Olives that evening carried a chill that had nothing to do with the season. It was a dry, restless breeze that rustled the leaves of the ancient trees, creating a sound like 1,000 whispering voices. Elias sat near the edge of the gathering, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes fixed not on the panoramic view of the temple gleaming across the valley, but on the back of the teacher. There were only a few of them there. The crowds had been left behind in the city, along with their noise, their demands, and their desperate hunger for miracles. Here, in the twilight, the atmosphere was different. It was heavy. The disciples, men Elias had grown to admire and sometimes fear, sat in a tight semicircle. They had asked a question that was burning in the minds of everyone in Jerusalem. They wanted to know about the end. They wanted timelines. They wanted to know when the stones of that great temple would be thrown down, and what signs would herald the close of the age. Elias watched Peter, whose hand rested unconsciously near his belt, as if ready to grasp a weapon that was not there. He saw the anxiety in the eyes of Andrew, who kept glancing back toward the city walls as if expecting an army to march out at any moment. They were expecting answers about wars. They were bracing themselves for talk of earthquakes, of famines, of great and terrible battles that would shake the foundations of the earth. And the teacher did speak of those things. He spoke of nations rising against nations. He spoke of deceptions that would mislead even the elect. But then his voice dropped, shifting from the thunder of geopolitical collapse to something far more intimate and terrifying. Because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Your support breathes life into these ancient warnings and gives strength to those who refuse to grow cold. Like and subscribe to help us reveal the truths that history often forgets. Do not look away now, because the darkness is just beginning to fall, and you won't believe the price one man must pay to keep his heart alive. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than the prophecy of falling stones. Elias felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest. He looked around, wondering if the others had heard it the way he had. They seemed focused on the external threats, on the persecution and the trials, but Elias felt the words burrow into his soul. The love of many will grow cold. It was not a prediction of hate. It was not a warning that they would suddenly turn into monsters. It was something subtler. It was a temperature, a gradual lowering of the heat that kept a human soul alive. Elias looked at John, the youngest, whose face was usually open and warm. Would that face one day become a mask of indifference? He looked at his own hands, calloused from work and service. Would there come a day when he would refuse to extend them to a brother in need because the cost was too high? The teacher continued speaking, but Elias was trapped in that single phrase. He understood what lawlessness meant. It was not just crime in the streets. It was a life untethered from the order of God. It was a world where truth was relative, where loyalty was convenient, and where every man did what was right in his own eyes. In such a world, trust would be the first casualty, and without trust, love could not breathe. Elias shifted his position on the hard ground. He realized with a jolt of fear that the warning was not just for the world out there, it was for them. The teacher had said the love of many. That meant the crowd. That meant the believers. That meant the people sitting right here on this mountain. As the twilight deepened into night, the teacher stood up. The discourse was over, but the silence remained. Elias stood as well, his legs stiff. He found himself walking beside Silas, a companion he had known since childhood. Silas was a man of sharp wit and quick laughter, someone Elias trusted with his life. "Did you hear that?" Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Silas glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "Hear what? The part about the abomination of desolation, or the part about fleeing to the mountains? We need to be ready, Elias, if the Romans come." "No," Elias interrupted, stopping on the path. "Not the Romans. The part about love. The part about us growing cold." Silas let out a short, dismissive breath. "That is just a figure of speech, Elias. He means people will get scared. It is natural. When the sword comes, you protect your own. That is not coldness. That is survival." Elias looked at his friend, really looked at him. In the dim light of the rising moon, the shadow of the olive branches cast a web across Silas's face, dividing it into fragments. "Is it?" Elias asked softly. "Or is that exactly how it starts? We call it survival. We call it wisdom. And piece by piece, we stop caring. Silas clapped a hand on Elias's shoulder. His grip was firm, but there was a tension in it that had not been there before. You think too much, my friend. We are the followers of the way. We would die for each other. That will never change. Silas turned and walked ahead, eager to rejoin the group descending toward the Garden of Gethsemane. Elias remained behind for a moment. He looked back at the spot where the teacher had sat. The prophecy echoed in his mind, not as a future event, but as a present shadow. He realized then that the end of the age would not just be a war over land or temples. It would be a war over the human heart. And as he walked down the dark path, Elias shivered, not from the wind, but from the terrifying thought that the coldness might have already begun to set in. Weeks bled into months, and the air in Jerusalem grew thick with a tension that tasted like dust and iron. It was not yet the chaos of open war, but the city felt like a clay vessel that had been left in the fire too long, solid to the eye, but spiderwebbed with invisible cracks waiting to shatter. Elias walked through the lower market, a basket woven of reeds tucked under his arm. This used to be his favorite part of the day. The market was the heartbeat of the city, a place of vibrant colors, the smell of roasted cumin and baking bread, and the loud, boisterous exchange of news. But today, the noise felt different. It was loud, but it was guarded. People shouted to sell their wares, but they spoke in hushed tones when they greeted one another. Eyes darted side to side. Shoulders were hunched, protecting personal space with aggressive defensiveness. He stopped at a stall selling lentils. The merchant, a man named Caleb who had known Elias's father, usually greeted him with a joke or a blessing. Today, Caleb did not look up. He was arguing with a woman, a widow from the look of her mourning garb, over a handful of grain. The price is the price, woman, Caleb snapped, his hand covering the measure of lentils as if she might snatch it. But I bought the same amount yesterday for 2 coppers less, the woman pleaded, her voice trembling. It is all I have. Caleb looked around, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for Roman soldiers or perhaps just judgment from his peers. Finding none, his face hardened. Yesterday was yesterday. Today, the grain shipments are delayed from the north. The roads are unsafe. If you cannot pay, move along. You are blocking the customers. Elias stood frozen. Caleb was a man who gave alms to the temple. He was a man who knew the law. Yet here he was, staring at a hungry woman not with malice, but with a terrifying indifference. It was the logic of scarcity. If I give to you, I might not have enough for me. Here, Elias said, stepping forward. He reached into his tunic and pulled out 3 small coins. He placed them on the wooden counter. Give her the grain, Caleb, and give her a full measure. Caleb looked at the coins, then at Elias. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a flicker of annoyance, masked as relief. He scooped the lentils into the woman's cloth without a word. The woman grasped the bundle, whispered a hurried blessing to Elias, and vanished into the crowd, her head down, afraid to draw attention to her good fortune. You are a fool, Elias, Caleb muttered as he swept the coins into a pouch. You cannot feed the whole city. I was only feeding one person, Caleb, Elias replied, keeping his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Since when did hunger become a nuisance to you? Caleb leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a hiss. Since the rumors started, they say the procurator is going to seize the grain stores. They say the zealots are hoarding supplies in the hills. Everyone is taking what they can. You would be wise to do the same. Compassion is a luxury for peaceful times, boy. In a storm, you batten down the hatches. Elias turned away, his stomach churning. Compassion is a luxury. The words felt like a physical blow. This was the lawlessness the teacher had spoken of. It was not just thieves breaking in. It was the breaking of the covenant between neighbors. It was the moment when survival replaced duty. He continued through the market, but the joy of the walk was gone. He began to notice the pattern everywhere. 2 men bumped shoulders near the Damascus gate. Instead of an apology, hands went instantly to the concealed knives in their belts. A child fell and scraped his knee near the water cistern. 3 people stepped over him before a 4th finally stopped. And even she looked around nervously before helping the boy up. The city was losing its softness. Later that afternoon, Elias found himself in the courtyard of the house where the believers gathered. He needed to wash the taste of the market from his spirit. He saw Silas sitting in the corner, sharpening a small tool used for leatherworking. Silas looked up, his face tight. "Where have you been?" Silas asked, not as a greeting, but as an interrogation. "At the market," Elias replied, sitting down on a stone bench. "It is getting worse out there, Silas. People are afraid. They are looking at each other like enemies." Silas did not stop sharpening. The rhythmic shh of the stone against metal grated on Elias's nerves. "I heard something today," Silas said, keeping his eyes on his work. "I heard that the authorities have a list of names of those who follow the Nazarene. They say they are paying for information." Elias felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" Silas looked up finally, his eyes dark and unreadable. "The point is, people are talking, and if there is money involved, loyalty will be tested." "We are brothers," Elias said, though the word felt fragile in his mouth. "We have shared everything. No one would betray the group for a few silver pieces." Silas let out a short, humorless laugh. "You still see the world as it should be, Elias. Not as it is. Look at the market. Look at Caleb. If a man will cheat a widow for a handful of lentils because he is afraid of tomorrow, what will he do to save his own skin when the soldiers come knocking?" Elias wanted to argue. He wanted to shake Silas and tell him that love was stronger than fear. But the memory of Caleb's hard eyes stopped him. The teacher's warning on the mountain rushed back to him. The love of many will grow cold. It was happening. It was not an event that would be announced with trumpets. It was happening in the silence of a withheld apology. It was happening in the hesitation to help a fallen child. It was happening in the way Silas was looking at the door, calculating escape routes instead of welcoming guests. That evening, as the sun set over the limestone walls of Jerusalem, turning the city a bruised shade of purple, Elias sat on the roof of his small dwelling. He felt an exhaustion that went deeper than his bones. It was the exhaustion of guarding his heart. He realized that the temptation was not to become evil. The temptation was to become numb, to stop feeling the sting of the widow's poverty, to stop engaging with the fear in his friend's eyes, to build a wall so high that nothing could hurt him anymore. But he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the moment he built that wall, the cold would win. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for the strength to keep feeling, even as the world around him began to freeze. The cracks were invisible, but they were spreading, and Elias knew that soon the ground beneath them would simply give way. The night the fracture finally happened, the moon was hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds, leaving the winding alleyways of the lower city in suffocating darkness. Elias moved through the shadows with the practiced quiet of a man who knew that noise could equal death. He was heading toward the house of Mary, the mother of Mark, where the believers had agreed to meet. The atmosphere in the city had shifted from anxious to predatory. The Roman patrols had doubled, and worse, the temple guards were now stopping men at random, demanding to know their affiliations. Elias slipped through the narrow door of the courtyard, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, the flame flickering low to avoid drawing attention. About 20 people were gathered, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with the shared exhaustion of the hunted. He scanned the room for Silas. He wanted to tell Silas about the incident at the market, to share the burden of the coldness he had witnessed in Caleb. But Silas was not there. This was unusual. Silas was always the first to arrive, always the one to check the exits, the one who made sure the door was barred. "Where is Silas?" Elias whispered to James, a distinct uneasiness coiling in his stomach. James shrugged, rubbing his tired eyes. "He said he had business near the sheep gate. He said he would be late." "Business? At this hour?" Before Elias could press further, the heavy wooden beam barring the courtyard gate groaned. It was not a knock. It was a collision, a violent, rhythmic thudding that shook the dust from the doorframe. "Open in the name of the high priest." Panic, sharp and immediate, erupted in the room. It was not the chaotic screaming of a mob, but the silent, terrified scramble of prey, realizing the trap had snapped shut. People dove for the back exit, a narrow window that led to an adjacent roof. Elias stood frozen, his mind racing. How did they know? This meeting had been decided only hours ago. No one knew the location except the gate splintered inward with a deafening crash. Torches flooded the small courtyard with harsh, orange light. blinding after the darkness. Armed men poured in, the metal of their breastplates clashing. It was the temple guard, accompanied by 2 Roman auxiliaries, who looked bored by the proceedings. "Stay where you are," a captain bellowed, drawing a short sword. Elias was pushed back against the limestone wall. He saw James tackled to the ground. He saw the elderly Mary weeping silently in the corner, but his eyes were drawn to the figure entering last. The man walked not with the aggression of the soldiers, but with a strange, slumped resignation. He kept his face hidden in the folds of his cloak. The captain turned to this figure. "Point them out. Which ones are the leaders?" The figure hesitated. Then a hand emerged from the cloak, a hand Elias knew better than his own. It was a hand with a scar on the thumb from a childhood accident with a carving knife. The hand pointed first at James, then at Peter's brother, and then, trembling slightly, it pointed at Elias. The figure lowered the hood. It was Silas. The world seemed to stop spinning. The shouts of the guards, the weeping of the women, the clash of metal, it all faded into a dull roar, like water rushing over ears. Elias stared at his friend. Silas looked pale, his skin sheen with sweat, his eyes refusing to meet Elias's gaze. He looked at the floor, at the wall, at the captain's boots, anywhere but at the man he had called brother. "Why?" Elias breathed the word, though no sound came out. Silas seemed to hear it anyway. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, their eyes locked. Elias expected to see malice. He expected to see the face of a monster, but he did not. He saw fear. Naked, pathetic, overwhelming fear. He saw a man who had calculated the cost of loyalty and found it too expensive. Silas had not sold them out for hate. He had sold them out because he wanted to live. He wanted to wake up tomorrow in his own bed, not in a cell. He had chosen survival over love. "Take them," the captain ordered. In the ensuing chaos, a table was overturned. The oil lamp shattered, plunging the corner of the room into darkness. Elias, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that felt more like nausea, saw a gap in the line of soldiers. He did not think. He reacted. He threw himself toward the narrow back window. A hand grabbed his tunic. It was Silas. For a moment, they were close enough to embrace. Silas held the fabric, his grip weak, indecisive. "Let me go," Elias hissed, his voice breaking with a pain that had nothing to do with physical danger. Silas's hand trembled. The conflict in his eyes was a storm of guilt and self-preservation. Then, slowly, Silas opened his fingers. He let go. Elias scrambled through the window, scraping his skin raw against the stone, and dropped onto the flat roof of the neighboring house. He ran. He ran across the rooftops of Jerusalem, leaping over gaps that would have terrified him in daylight. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He collapsed in the shadow of a water cistern near the Esseni quarter. He was safe. He had escaped. But as he lay there, gasping for air, he realized the soldiers had not needed to capture him to destroy him. The blade had already gone in. It had entered his back, pushed by the hand of his closest friend. Elias curled into a ball on the cold stone. He did not weep. He felt something inside him wither, a vital root severed from its source. The teacher's words rang in his head, no longer a prophecy but a verdict. They will betray one another. Elias felt the cold spreading from his chest to his limbs. He realized, with a desolate certainty, that he would never trust anyone fully again. Jerusalem the next morning was bathed in golden sunlight, a cruel contrast to the gray ruin of Elias's spirit. The betrayal of the previous night had not been a public spectacle. The city went on. Merchants shouted, beggars pleaded, and priests offered the morning sacrifice. But for the small community of believers, the world had irrevocably changed. Elias moved to a safe house in the upper city, a small room owned by a wealthy sympathizer who kept his faith hidden. But the sanctuary felt like a prison. News trickled in throughout the day. James had been beaten but released. Others were still being held. But the name on everyone's lips was Silas. By midday, 3 other believers arrived at the safe house. Among them was Sarah, a woman whose fierce devotion had always inspired Elias. But today, Sarah did not greet him with the holy kiss or a word of peace. She stood near the doorway, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her eyes darting between Elias and the others. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Was it Silas?" Elias sat in the corner, staring at his hands. It was Silas. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, a man named Thomas spoke up, stepping away from the window. How do we know it stopped with him? How do we know he did not give them more names? How do we know, he looked at Elias, his eyes narrowing, that you did not escape because they let you go, to lead them to the rest of us? Elias looked up, stunned. Thomas, I ran. He grabbed my tunic, and I pulled away. Or so you say, Sarah cut in. Her voice was cold, devoid of the warmth that used to define her. Silas was your brother, Elias. You ate from the same bowl, you walked the same roads. If he could turn, why not you? Who can we trust now? Elias looked at Sarah. He saw the panic behind her accusation. It was the poison of betrayal. It did not just destroy the relationship with the traitor, it destroyed the capacity to trust anyone else. The lawlessness was working. It was severing the bonds that held them together. I am not Silas, Elias said quietly. Sarah turned away. I hope not. But from now on, I tell no one where I sleep. I suggest you all do the same. She left the room. One by one, the others drifted away, creating distance, finding corners, whispering in pairs, but falling silent when a third approached. The unity of the spirit was fracturing into shards of paranoia. Elias remained in his corner, feeling the isolation wrap around him like a shroud. He realized he was doing it too, scanning Thomas's face for deceit, wondering if the owner of the house was truly a sympathizer or a spy. The coldness was contagious. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, near the Antonia fortress, a different kind of coldness was taking hold. Marcus, a decurion in the Roman auxiliary, sat on the edge of a stone bed, rubbing the dust from his face. He was tired of this city. He hated the heat, the strange laws, the way the locals looked at him with veiled hatred. The door to his quarters opened softly. A woman slipped inside. It was Lydia. She was Jewish, the wife of a merchant who was currently away in Galilee. She was beautiful, but her beauty was edged with a desperate, frantic quality. You are late, Marcus grunted, not standing up. I had to be careful, Lydia whispered, removing her veil. The neighbors are watching. They suspect something. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound. Let them suspect. I have a sword. They have nothing. He reached out and pulled her toward him. There was no tenderness in his touch, and there was no love in her eyes. Lydia did not come to Marcus because she adored him. She came because her husband was cruel, because her life felt like a cage, and because Marcus represented power in a city where everything was falling apart. Being close to the power felt like safety. And Marcus? He did not love Lydia. He used her to feel something other than the boredom and the underlying fear of a rebellion that everyone knew was coming. Their relationship was a violation of every law, Roman and Jewish alike. It was lawlessness in its most intimate form. Do you have the coin? Lydia asked, pulling away slightly. Marcus smirked and tossed a silver denarius onto the bed. Always business with you, Lydia. I need to survive, Marcus. We all do. She took the coin. They fell together, not in passion, but in a collision of needs. It was a hollow act, a temporary numbing of the soul. Outside the window, the sounds of the temple chants drifted on the wind, speaking of holiness and order. Inside, there was only the chaotic grasping of two people trying to wring pleasure out of a dying world. Later, as Lydia dressed to leave, she looked at Marcus. Do you think there will be a war? Marcus stared at the ceiling. There is always a war, Lydia. The only question is who dies first. Lydia slipped out into the night, clutching the silver coin, the price of her fidelity. Marcus turned over and went to sleep, indifferent to the woman who had just left, indifferent to the city he occupied. Back in the safe house, Elias watched the shadows lengthen. He thought of Sarah's suspicion. He thought of Silas's betrayal. He felt his heart hardening, layer by layer. It felt safer this way. If he expected nothing from anyone, he could not be hurt. If he loved no one, he could not be betrayed. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he did not pray for his friends. He prayed only that he would survive the night. A week after the betrayal, Elias sought refuge not in a hideout, but in a place of learning. He needed to understand what was happening. His emotions were a wreck, so he turned to his intellect. He went to the house of Matthias, a respected elder and scholar who had been a follower of the way since the beginning. The main room of Matthias's house was filled with scrolls and tablets. Several men sat in a circle, their voices raised in spirited debate. Elias entered, hoping for comfort, hoping for a word of pastoral care regarding the devastation that Silas had wrought. But as he listened, he realized they were not discussing the betrayal. They were not discussing the fear gripping the community or the hunger in the streets. They were arguing about the timeline of the resurrection of the dead. But does the transformation happen in the twinkling of an eye, or is there an intermediate state? One scholar argued, waving a finger in the air. The Greek text suggests a metamorphosis, a complete structural change. No, Matthias countered, his voice smooth and detached. You are missing the prophetic implication of the feast days. The pattern must hold. Elias stood at the edge of the circle, stunned. Men were in prison. Families were starving. Friends were betraying friends. And here, the leaders were dissecting grammar. Matthias. Elias interrupted, his voice rough. The elder looked up, annoyed at the break in his train of thought. Elias, we are in the middle of a discourse. What is it? Silas betrayed us, Elias said. The community is fracturing. People are terrified to speak to one another. What are we doing about it? Matthias sighed, adjusting his robes. We are aware of the tragedy of Silas. It is a fulfillment of the falling away. It is to be expected. But we cannot let emotional disturbances distract us from the study of the truth. If we do not understand the doctrine correctly, how will we stand in the end? Emotional disturbances, Elias repeated, incredulous. We are talking about human beings. We are talking about love dying. And we are talking about eternal truth, the other scholar snapped. Without order, without correct knowledge, love is just sentimentality. At that moment, a knocking came at the door. It was a low, desperate sound. A servant girl opened it to reveal a young man, dirty and bleeding from a gash on his forehead. It was a refugee from the Galilee region, seeking shelter. Master, the servant girl said to Matthias, this man says he has nowhere to go. Matthias waved a hand dismissively. Tell him to go to the synagogue of the freedmen. They have a fund for refugees. We are occupied here with holy matters. We cannot turn this house into a hostel every time someone scrapes their knee. The servant girl hesitated, looking at the bleeding man, then back at her master. But the synagogues are closed, sir. It is past curfew. Then let him sleep in the street, the scholar shouted. Close the door. We are losing the thread of the argument. The door was closed. The lock clicked. The bleeding man was left in the darkness. Elias watched this happen. He watched the ease with which Matthias turned back to his scroll, and then something terrible happened to Elias. Instead of shouting, instead of opening the door himself, he felt a cold logic settle over him. Matthias was right. A voice in his head whispered, You cannot save everyone. If you open the door, the Romans might come in. If you focus on the pain, you will go mad. The only safety is in the mind. Elias stepped forward into the circle. He cleared his throat. Actually, Matthias, Elias said, his voice steady and devoid of emotion regarding the Greek text. If you look at the root word, it implies an immediate change, not a process. The syntax demands it. Matthias smiled, a thin, intellectual smile. Ah, you see, Elias understands. Come, sit. Let us examine this. Elias sat down. He picked up a scroll. He engaged his mind. He debated the finer points of theology with brilliance and clarity. He felt the admiration of the other men. He felt the safety of the abstract. But outside, on the other side of the thick wooden door, the bleeding man limped away into the dangerous night, and inside Elias's chest, the last flickering candle of compassion sputtered and went out. He had found a way to cope. He would replace love with knowledge. He would replace people with ideas. He would be right. He would be safe. And he would be utterly, devastatingly cold. The discussion continued late into the night. They solved all the riddles of the text. They drew perfect diagrams of the future. They felt righteous and wise. But in the corner of the room, unseen by the scholars, the spirit of the warning sat watching them. Because lawlessness will increase, the love of many will grow cold. It had happened. Not through sin, but through Scripture, detached from service. Elias had joined the ranks of the numb. He felt a strange sense of relief. It was so much easier to be a scholar than a brother. It was so much easier to study the light than to be the warmth. The transformation was complete. Elias, The lover of people was gone. Elias, the guardian of truth, remained, and he did not even notice the loss. The persecution did not arrive as a sudden thunderstorm. It arrived as a relentless, suffocating humidity, day after day. News reached Elias of fresh disasters. A deacon arrested in the temple courts. A family's property seized by the magistrates on false charges of sedition. A riot in the dispute of the distribution of food, where 3 believers were beaten into unconsciousness. In the beginning, months ago, such news would have sent Elias to his knees. He would have fasted. He would have wept until his throat was raw, pleading with the heavens for intervention. He would have rushed to the homes of the affected, carrying bread, carrying oil, carrying his own heart in his hands to offer comfort. But that was the old Elias. The Elias who lived before the betrayal of Silas, before the cynicism of the market, and before the intellectual retreat into the house of Matthias. Now, Elias sat in his room, listening to a messenger describe the scourging of a man named Stephen. The messenger was breathless, his eyes wide with the horror of what he had witnessed. He described the violence, the blood, the sound of the whip cracking against skin. Elias listened, and he continued to eat his evening meal. He broke a piece of bread, dipped it into a bowl of broth, and chewed slowly. He swallowed. He did not lose his appetite. "It is a tragedy," Elias said, his voice flat. But Stephen was always reckless. He spoke too loudly near the Solomon's port. He should have known better. The messenger stared at Elias, stunned. "He is our brother, Elias. He is in the dungeon. He might die. Then he will receive the crown of life," Elias replied, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "God is sovereign. If Stephen suffers, it is because it was ordained. We must accept the will of the Almighty without hysteria." The messenger stood up, shaking his head slowly. "You sound like them, Elias. You sound like the priests who judge us. Where is your grief?" "I have no energy for grief," Elias said, and for a moment, it was the honest truth. When the messenger left, slamming the door behind him, Elias told himself that he had achieved a higher state of faith. He called it peace. He told himself that he was no longer tossed to and fro by the waves of emotion. He was steady. He was a rock. But deep down, in a place he refused to examine, he knew it was not peace. It was exhaustion. His soul was tired. It was tired of caring. It was tired of the sharp, stinging pain of empathy. Every time he opened his heart to someone else's suffering, it felt like a withdrawal from a bank account that was already overdrawn. He had nothing left to give. So, his spirit had done what the body does in freezing weather. It had shunted the blood away from the extremities to preserve the core. He had stopped feeling the pain of others so that he could ensure his own survival. 2 days later, the wailing began. It came from the house next door. Miriam, a widow who had been like a second mother to Elias, had lost her only son to a fever. The sound of her grief was primal, a tearing, jagged scream that pierced through the stone walls. Elias sat up on his mat. His first instinct, the ghost of his old instinct, was to run to her, to hold her hands, to weep with those who weep, as the commandment said. But then the fatigue washed over him. He thought of the hours of crying he would have to endure. He thought of the awkwardness of sitting in a house of mourning. He thought of the drain it would place on his mind, which he needed for his studies. He waited an hour before going over. When he entered Miriam's house, the room was full of neighbors. Miriam sat on the floor, covered in ashes, rocking back and forth. When she saw Elias, she reached out her hands, her eyes pleading for the warmth he used to possess. "Elias," she sobbed, "he is gone. My boy is gone. Where is the mercy?" Elias stood over her. He did not kneel. He did not touch her. He clasped his hands behind his back. "Miriam," he said, his voice smooth and detached, "we must not sorrow as those who have no hope. Your son is asleep. To question the timing of his death is to question the wisdom of the Creator. You must be strong. You must show the unbelievers that our faith is rational." Miriam's hands dropped. She looked up at him, and the desperate need in her eyes turned to confusion, and then to a dull recognition. She saw that the man standing before her was not a comforter. He was a statue. "Thank you for your words," she whispered, turning away from him. Elias left the house feeling a perverse sense of victory. He had not broken down. He had spoken the truth. He had remained composed. He walked back to his own dwelling, convinced that this callousness was actually maturity. He told himself that emotions were a weakness of the flesh, and that he had finally conquered them. He lay down to sleep, but his eyes remained open. He tried to summon a tear for Miriam's son. He tried to force himself to feel a pang of sadness, but there was nothing. Just a dry, hollow silence in his chest. The numbness was no longer a shield he held up. It had become his skin. He was not protecting his heart anymore. He was encasing it in stone. And the most terrifying part was that he slept better that night than he had in years. As the season turned, the atmosphere in Jerusalem grew even darker. The Romans were tightening their grip, and the zealots were sharpening their knives. In this environment of suspicion, Elias completed his withdrawal. He stopped going to the communal meals. He told the others that he needed solitude to pray and study the prophecies, to prepare the group for the end times. But in truth, he avoided the gatherings because they required engagement. They required him to look into people's eyes, to listen to their fears, to share his food, and he was done sharing. He began to rationalize his isolation as wisdom. The proverb said, "A prudent man sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it." Elias repeated this to himself like a mantra. He was prudent. The others, who still met in secret, who still took in refugees, who still risked their lives to feed the poor, they were simple. They were naive. They were going to get themselves killed, and Elias had decided that he was too valuable to die. He had convinced himself that his survival was essential for the faith. He was the one who understood the texts. He was the one who held the correct doctrines. Therefore, protecting himself was a holy act. Self-preservation was rebranded as stewardship. One evening, Elias had to cross the city to retrieve a scroll from a contact near the fish gate. He waited until the moon was obscured by clouds before venturing out. He walked quickly, sticking to the shadows, his hood pulled low. The streets were empty, save for the occasional patrol of soldiers or the scavenging dogs. Elias moved with a focused determination, his eyes scanning the periphery for threats. He felt smart. He felt capable. He was navigating the apocalypse with a clear head. As he turned into a narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut, he heard a sound. It was a groan, low, wet, and filled with pain. Elias stopped. He pressed his back against the rough limestone wall and held his breath. He peered into the darkness. A few paces ahead, a shape lay crumpled against a pile of refuse. It was a man. He was lying on his side, clutching his abdomen. Dark liquid pooled beneath him, glistening in the faint light. "Help," the man wheezed. His voice was thick, likely from blood. "Please." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. The old stories, the stories the teacher had told, flashed through his mind. The man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, the priest who passed by, the Levite who looked away, the Samaritan who stopped. Elias looked at the man. He was not a Samaritan. He was a Jew. Judging by his tunic, he was bleeding, he was dying. But then, the new logic, the cold wisdom that had taken root in Elias's soul, began to speak. "It could be a trap," the voice whispered. "Thieves use injured men as bait. As soon as you bend down, they will jump from the shadows and cut your throat. And if you die, who will teach the truth? Who will guard the doctrine?" The man groaned again, shifting his leg. The movement was weak. He was clearly not faking. "Even if it is not a trap," the voice continued, smooth and rational, "if you stop, you will get blood on your clothes. The patrol will see you. They will arrest you for the assault. You will be thrown into prison, and your work will end. Is it worth risking the entire mission for one stranger?" Elias stood there, paralyzed, not by fear, but by calculation. He was weighing the value of a life against the value of his own safety, and the scale was tipping heavily toward safety. "Water," the man begged. "Just water." Elias had a water skin on his belt. It was full. He could step forward, kneel down, and give the man a drink. It would take moments. But compassion was expensive. In a lawless world, mercy was a liability. Elias looked at the dying man, and then he looked at the path ahead. He stepped away from the wall. He did not run. Running would attract attention. He walked. He walked with a purposeful, steady stride. He moved to the far side of the alley, giving the body a wide berth. He did not look down as he passed. He fixed his eyes on the exit of the alleyway. "I am sorry," he whispered to the air, but the words were empty. I cannot save you. I must save the truth." He left the man behind. The groans faded as Elias turned the corner and merged back onto the main street. He expected to feel a crushing weight of guilt. He expected the face of the teacher to haunt him, but he felt nothing of the sort. Instead, he felt a strange sense of relief. He felt that he had passed a test. He had not let emotion dictate his actions. He had been smart. He had been prudent. He had chosen the greater good over the immediate need. He retrieved the scroll and returned home without incident. He barred his door, washed his hands, and sat down to read. The words on the parchment spoke of righteousness and the kingdom of heaven. Elias read them with a clear conscience. He did not see the irony. He did not see that by saving his life, he was losing it. He did not see that the truth he was protecting was worthless without the love he had just left bleeding in an alley. From his window, he looked out over the city. In the distance, he saw the flicker of a torch near the house of Marcus, the Roman soldier. He saw Marcus standing on a balcony, looking down at a woman, Lydia, who was weeping at his gate. Marcus turned his back on her and went inside. Elias watched this scene and felt a surge of judgment. "Look at the pagans," he thought. "They have no morals. They use people and discard them. Thank God I am not like them." He did not realize that he and Marcus were now brothers in spirit. They were both citizens of the new kingdom of coldness. They both wore the mask of wisdom to hide the rot of their souls. Elias blew out his lamp and lay down in the dark, a man who knew everything about God but no longer recognized his voice in the cry of the suffering. The cold had reached his core, and he mistook the numbness for holiness. The separation between Elias and Sarah did not happen with a shout or a public denouncement. It happened in the quiet space between words, in the deliberate turning of a shoulder, and in the refusal to meet a gaze. They met one final time near the pool of Siloam, not by arrangement, but by the inevitable friction of living in a shrinking city. Sarah was carrying water. Her posture stooped not from the weight of the jar, but from the weight of the sorrow she carried for the community. She saw Elias standing near the colonnade, watching the crowds with that new, detached expression he wore like armor. She hesitated, then walked toward him. "Elias," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of the hope that had once defined it. "We missed you at the breaking of bread. Thomas asked for you." Elias did not look at her. He kept his eyes on a group of Roman soldiers patrolling the upper ridge. "I have been busy, Sarah. The study of the law requires isolation." "It requires isolation, or it requires safety?" Sarah asked, stepping into his line of sight. "We know what you did, Elias, or rather, what you did not do." Elias finally looked at her. His face was a mask of cool irritation. "I do not know what you mean." "The man in the alley," Sarah whispered, lowering her voice so the passers-by would not hear. "The man from Galilee who was beaten. He survived, Elias. He crawled to the door of the tanner. He told us about the man who walked past him. A man wearing a tunic like yours. A man who looked like you." Elias felt a flicker of defensiveness, but he suffocated it instantly with his logic. "I walked past a potential ambush, Sarah. It was a strategic decision. If I had died, who would preserve the teachings?" "Strategic," Sarah repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Is that what we are now? Strategists? I thought we were followers." "We must be wise as serpents," Elias quoted, using the scripture as a shield. "And harmless as doves," Sarah finished. "You forgot the second part. You have become the serpent, Elias. You are cold. You look at us, and you do not see brothers and sisters. You see liabilities. You see risks." Elias stiffened. "I am protecting myself so that I can protect the truth." "The truth does not need your protection, Elias," Sarah said, hoisting her jar onto her shoulder. "It needs your life, but you have already buried your life in the ground, like the wicked servant with his talent. Stay in your room, stay safe, but do not call it faith." She walked away. Elias watched her go, and he felt a distinct sensation of a cord being cut. He told himself it was for the best. Sarah was emotional. She was reckless. She would get them all killed. He established a boundary in his mind. He would no longer engage with those who put emotion above survival. It was a cold, hard line, and he stepped behind it with relief. On the other side of the city, another boundary was being drawn, this one in blood and betrayal. Lydia stood in the quarters of Marcus, the Roman decurion. The room was sparse. smelling of leather polish and old wine. Lydia was trembling. Her husband had returned early. He knew. He had found the coin Marcus had given her. "You have to help me," Lydia pleaded, reaching for Marcus's arm. "He will kill me. He has the right. Under your laws and ours, you must take me in, or give me passage to Caesarea." Marcus pulled his arm away as if she were a beggar asking for copper. He was polishing his helmet, and he did not stop his work. "This is not my problem, Lydia," Marcus said, his voice bored. "Not your problem?" Lydia's voice rose to a shriek. "I risked everything for you. I gave you information. I gave you myself." "You gave me what I paid for," Marcus said, holding the helmet up to inspect the shine. "It was a transaction. It is finished." "Marcus, please. They will stone me, or he will strangle me in my sleep." Marcus finally turned to her. His eyes were the color of the sea in winter gray, turbulent and utterly devoid of warmth. "Listen to me. The Legion is moving out in 2 days. I travel light. I do not carry baggage, and that is what you are, baggage." Lydia stared at him. She saw the man she had thought was a refuge. She realized now that his strength was not protection, it was indifference. He did not care if she lived or died, as long as his career remained intact. "Get out," Marcus said, returning to his polishing, "before I call the guard and tell them you are a thief." Lydia backed away. She stumbled out of the fortress and into the blinding sun. She walked through the streets, numb, the rejection burning in her chest like a coal. She passed Elias near the Temple Mount. Elias saw her. He saw the devastation on her face. He knew who she was. The gossip had reached everyone. Elias looked at her and felt a surge of self-righteousness. "See," he thought, "that is the wages of sin. She betrayed her husband, and now she pays the price. I am righteous. I am safe." He did not offer help. He did not offer a kind word. He drew his robe tighter around himself and crossed to the other side of the street. It was the second time he had walked away from the dying. This time, the death was invisible, but it was just as final. The boundaries were set. The walls were up, and inside them, the air was freezing. The rumors of war ceased to be rumors and became a vibration in the ground. The 12th Legion was marching. The zealots were seizing the upper city. Jerusalem was no longer a city. It was a cage. Elias stopped going out entirely. He had stockpiled dried figs, grain, and water in his small room. He barred the door with a heavy beam of oak. He covered the single window with a thick cloth to prevent light from escaping and to prevent arrows from entering. He told himself this was wisdom. Hide yourself for a little while, until the fury has passed. The prophets had said. He was obeying the scripture. He was waiting out the storm. But as the days turned into weeks, the room began to shrink. The silence, which he had once craved for his studies, began to scream at him. He would sit for hours, staring at the flicker of his oil lamp, listening to the distant sounds of shouting and the clash of metal. Every footstep outside his door made his heart seize. Every cry in the night made him blow out his lamp and sit in the terrifying dark, clutching a heavy stone he kept for defense. Fear became his companion. It sat with him at his meager meals. It lay beside him on his mat. It whispered to him that everyone was an enemy. The neighbor who knocked to ask for oil, a spy. The child crying in the street, a trap to lure him out. He tried to pray. He knelt on the stone floor and closed his eyes. But when he spoke the name of the Almighty, the words felt like dry leaves crumbling in his mouth. He asked for peace, but peace did not come. He asked for protection, but he felt exposed. He realized with a creeping horror that he could not find God in the room. He had prioritized safety over love, and in doing so, he had cut himself off from the very nature of the God he claimed to serve. God was love. Elias had banished love. Therefore, Elias had banished God. He was alive. His heart beat. His lungs drew air, but he was dead. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was not the aggressive pounding of soldiers. It was a rhythmic, familiar tap. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. It was the secret signal of the believers. Elias froze. He knew that knock. It was Thomas, or perhaps Andrew. Someone from the group was standing just inches away, on the other side of the wood. "Elias," a voice whispered. It was Thomas. "Elias, are you there? We are leaving. We found a way out through the drainage tunnels near the southern wall." We are going to Pella. Come with us." Elias sat on his mat, his knuckles white as he gripped the fabric of his tunic. If he opened the door, he would have to leave his fortress. He would have to traverse the dangerous streets. He would have to trust Thomas. He would have to trust the group. What if Thomas had been captured? What if this was a trick? What if the Romans were standing right behind him with swords drawn? "Elias," Thomas whispered again, more urgent this time. "We are not leaving you behind. Open the door." Elias held his breath. A single tear leaked from his eye, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of sheer, paralyzing terror. He wanted to open the door. He wanted to be with his brothers. But the coldness had done its work. It had frozen his will. He remained silent. He heard Thomas sigh. He heard a hand rest against the wood for a moment, a gesture of farewell. "May the Lord have mercy on you, Elias," Thomas whispered. Then the footsteps retreated. They grew fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the noise of the city. Elias was alone. He was safe. He had his food. He had his water. He had his life. He curled up on the floor and wept, not loudly, but with the silent, shaking sobs of a man who realizes he has just locked himself in his own tomb. The prophecy was fulfilled in him. The love of many would grow cold. But Elias realized the terrible twist. When your love grows cold, you do not just freeze others out, you freeze yourself in. Time lost its meaning in the dark room. It might have been days, it might have been weeks. Elias drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his body weakened by rationing, his mind frayed by the constant adrenaline of fear. In his delirium, the walls of the room seemed to dissolve. He was no longer in the besieged city. He was back by the Sea of Galilee. The water was blue, painfully bright, lapping against the shore with a gentle rhythm. He saw the teacher. He was sitting on a rock, roasting fish over a charcoal fire. The smell of the fire was vivid smoke and salt. The disciples were there, Peter, John, and even Silas. They were laughing. It was the laughter of men who had nothing to lose because they had found everything. Elias stood on the periphery of the dream, watching them. He felt a terrible longing, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Why are you standing there, Elias?" the teacher asked, looking up. His eyes were not judgmental. They were inviting. "I am afraid," Elias replied in the dream. "The world is dangerous. People betray each other. Love is too expensive." The teacher broke a piece of fish and held it out. "Is it? Or is the cost of not loving higher? Look at yourself, Elias. You are warm, but you are burning up. You are safe, but you are dying." Elias looked down at his hands in the dream. They were turning to stone. The gray infection was spreading up his arms, turning his flesh into granite. He tried to scream, but his stone throat made no sound. He woke up gasping, clutching his chest. The room was dark. The air was stale. The silence was absolute. He needed water. He reached for his jar, but it was light, empty. He shook it upside down. Not a drop. Panic, primal and immediate, overrode his fear of the outside. He could not die of thirst in this box. He had to go out. Elias unbarred the door. The wood groaned, protesting the movement. He pushed it open and stepped out into the blinding light of midday. The street was strangely deserted. The fighting must have moved to the western hill. He crept along the wall, heading toward the nearest cistern. His eyes were sensitive to the light, his legs weak. He felt like a ghost, haunting the land of the living. He reached the cistern, but the rope was cut. The bucket was gone. He stared into the black depth, despair washing over him. "Water," a voice croaked. Elias spun around, reaching for the stone in his pocket. Sitting in the shadow of an archway was a beggar. He was old, his eyes covered by the milky film of cataracts. He was blind. He was wrapped in rags that offered no protection against the coming winter. He held out a small, battered wooden bowl. Elias stared at him. The man was useless. He was a drain on resources. He should have died weeks ago. "I have no water," Elias snapped, his voice raspy. "The cistern is broken." The beggar tilted his head. He smiled. It was a toothless, broken smile, but it reached the edges of his face. "Ah," the beggar said, "then we share the thirst. Come, sit." Elias hesitated. "Sit? With this refuse?" "I have bread," the beggar whispered, reaching into his rags. He pulled out a small, hard crust. It was moldy on one side. It was barely a mouthful. He broke it in half. He held one half out to the empty air, searching for Elias's presence. "Take," the beggar said. "It is not much, but no one should eat alone." Elias looked at the dirty hand. He looked at the moldy bread. This man had nothing. He could not see the war. He could not see the danger. He had been abandoned by everyone. And yet, he was offering half of his survival to a stranger who had spoken to him with contempt. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. "Why give this to me?" The beggar shrugged. "Because if I keep it all, I am just a man eating bread in the dark. If I share it, we are brothers having a feast." The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. A man eating bread in the dark. That was exactly what Elias had become. He had hoarded his life, his truth, his safety, and he was starving. This beggar had given everything away, and he was full. Elias reached out. His fingers brushed the beggar's rough hand. He took the crust. He put it in his mouth. It tasted of dust and mold, but as he swallowed, he felt something happen in his chest. The ice cracked. It started as a small fissure, a sharp pain in the center of his heart. Then it spread. The numbness that had protected him for months began to shatter. A sob rose in his throat, violent and uncontrollable. Elias fell to his knees beside the beggar. He wept. He wept for Silas. He wept for the man in the alley. He wept for Lydia. He wept for Sarah and Thomas. He wept for the time he had wasted protecting a life that was not worth living. The beggar did not ask questions. He simply reached out and placed his hand on Elias's head, stroking his hair as if he were a child. "It is all right," the beggar murmured. "The world is hard, but we are here. We are here." Elias sat there in the dust, the tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He was thirsty, he was in danger, and he was defenseless. But for the first time in a long time, he was not cold. The warning had been true, but the teacher had also left a way back. And it started here, in the dirt, with a piece of broken bread. Elias stood up from the dust. His knees cracked, and his head swam with the dizziness of hunger, but his mind possessed a clarity he had not felt in months. He looked at the blind beggar, whose name he learned was Bartimaeus. "Come," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. "You cannot stay here." Bartimaeus tilted his head. "And where shall I go? The streets are full of wolves." "You will come with me," Elias replied. He took the blind man by the arm. The contact was repulsive to his old self, the dirt, the smell of sickness, but Elias forced himself to hold on. He guided Bartimaeus through the labyrinth of the terrified city. Every step was a battle against his own instinct for self-preservation. His mind screamed that he was making a mistake, that he was slowing himself down, that he was sharing his limited resources with a dying man. But Elias walked on. They reached his room. Elias unbarred the door and led the man inside. The air was stale, but it was safe. Elias sat Bartimaeus on his own mat. He went to his stockpile of grain, the grain he had hoarded while others starved. He looked at it. It was no longer a treasure. It was an accusation. He ground the grain. He mixed it with the last of his oil. He baked bread on a small fire. When it was ready, he did not eat first. He broke the loaf and placed the warm, steaming pieces into the beggar's hands. "Eat," Elias said. As he watched the man eat, Elias felt a physical pain in his chest. It was the pain of his heart thawing. It hurt to care. It hurt to look at this man and see a human being made in the image of God rather than a problem to be solved. But with the pain came a rush of oxygen. Elias realized he had been holding his breath for a year. That night, Elias did not sleep. He sat by the door, listening to the breathing of the stranger in his room. He realized that the journey back to warmth was not a single leap. It was a series of small, agonizing steps. It was choosing to give water when he was thirsty. It was choosing to listen when he was tired. The next morning, Elias made a decision. He took half of his remaining supplies and wrapped them in a cloth. "Stay here," he told Bartimaeus. "I will return." He went out into the street. He did not hide in the shadows this time. He walked to the house of the widow Miriam, the woman he had offered cold theology to instead of comfort. He knocked. When Miriam opened the door, she looked at him with dull, guarded eyes. "I have nothing left for you to take, Elias," she said. "I did not come to take," Elias said, holding out the bundle. I came to give, and I came to ask for your forgiveness. I offered you words when you needed tears. I was wrong." Miriam stared at the food, then at Elias's face. She saw the change. The stone mask was gone, replaced by a face etched with exhaustion and genuine sorrow. She began to weep, and this time Elias did not stand stiffly. He stepped forward and embraced her, absorbing her grief, letting it weigh him down, because he finally understood that love was meant to be heavy. 3 days later, the ultimate test arrived. Elias was sharing a meal with Bartimaeus when the door was shoved open. Elias scrambled for his defensive stone, but he froze when he saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was Silas. The traitor looked like a ghost. His tunic was torn to shreds. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. He had been beaten, likely by the very Romans he had tried to serve. They had used him and discarded him, just as the community had predicted. Silas stood there, swaying on his feet. He saw Elias. He saw the rock in Elias's hand. He did not raise his arms to defend himself. He simply dropped to his knees. "Do it," Silas whispered, his voice broken. "I have nowhere else to go. I tried to go to the temple, but they spat on me. I tried to go to my family, but they barred the door. You are the only one left. End it, Elias. I deserve it." Elias gripped the stone. His knuckles turned white. A roar of anger surged through him, hot, righteous, and justified. This was the man who had destroyed their peace. This was the man who had introduced fear into their fellowship. Justice demanded that he pay. The law demanded it. "Strike him," the voice of coldness hissed. "He is the reason you suffered. He is the reason love died." Elias looked at the jagged rock in his hand. He looked at the back of Silas's neck, exposed and vulnerable. It would be so easy. One blow. It would be over. Then Bartimaeus spoke from the corner. He could not see the scene, but he could feel the tension vibrating in the air. "Who is it, Elias?" the blind man asked softly. "Is it a brother?" The word hung in the air. "Brother." Elias looked at Silas. He remembered playing in the dust with him as children. He remembered Silas sharing his water during a drought. He remembered the fear in Silas's eyes, the night of the betrayal, the terrified animal panic that had driven him to sin. Elias realized that if he struck Silas now, he would be completing the work the Romans had started. He would be letting the coldness win. To execute justice without mercy was to become like the world they were trying to escape. Elias opened his hand. The stone fell to the floor with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the small room. Silas flinched, expecting the blow. When it did not come, he looked up, confused. Elias walked over to him. He knelt down in the dirt. He reached out and took Silas's face in his hands. "You cannot stay here," Elias said, his voice trembling. Silas nodded, tears streaming down his bruised face. "I know. I will go. I just wanted to see you one last time." "No," Elias interrupted. "I mean you cannot stay here on the floor. Get up, Silas. We have bread." Silas stared at him, unable to comprehend the grace. "But why? I sold you, and I abandoned the wounded," Elias said. "We have all fallen. We have all let the cold in, but we do not have to die in it." He pulled Silas to his feet. He brought him to the mat. He washed Silas's wounds, the water turning dark with blood and grime. It was not a sentimental moment. It was difficult. Every time Elias touched Silas, he had to fight the memory of the betrayal, but he fought it with the weapon of service. He washed the feet of the traitor, and in doing so, he felt the last remnants of the ice around his own heart shatter completely. The city was dying. The siege engines of the 12th Legion were pounding against the northern wall. Food was gone. Order had collapsed entirely. Bands of zealots roamed the streets, fighting each other as much as the Romans. But inside the room, a strange and powerful light had been kindled. Elias, Silas, and Bartimaeus had formed a nucleus of survival that was not based on hoarding, but on sharing. "We cannot stay hidden," Elias said one evening, listening to the screams from the street. "There are others out there, Sarah, Thomas. If they are still alive, they are alone, and alone they will not survive the cold." Silas looked terrified, but he nodded. "I will come with you. I know the back alleys. I know where the patrols are." They went out into the nightmare. Jerusalem was a landscape of smoke and rubble. They moved like shadows, checking the known hiding places of the believers. They found Sarah in the ruins of a bakery near the fish gate. She was tending to 3 orphans she had gathered from the streets. She looked gaunt, her skin gray with dust, her eyes hard and focused on survival. When she saw Elias, she stiffened, reaching for a knife she kept in her belt. Then she saw Silas behind him, and her eyes went wide with fury. "You brought him?" she hissed at Elias. "The traitor? Have you lost your mind?" "He is restored, Sarah," Elias said, stepping between them. "He is with us." "He killed us," Sarah screamed, though her voice was weak from hunger. "He failed," Elias said firmly, "just as I failed when I walked past the wounded. Just as you are failing now by holding on to hate when the world is ending. Look around you, Sarah. The walls are falling. The temple will burn. Do you want to meet the end with a knife in your hand, or with love in your heart?" Sarah looked at the knife. She looked at the terrified children clinging to her legs. She looked at Silas, who stood with his head bowed, accepting her judgment. The fight went out of her. She dropped the knife. She slumped against the stone wall, covering her face. "I am so tired, Elias," she sobbed. "I am just so tired of being strong." "Then stop," Elias said, moving to her side. "Let us carry you." They gathered the children. They moved together, a ragtag band of the broken and the betrayed. They found others, Thomas, hiding in a cellar, Mary, sick with fever. They brought them all together in a large, abandoned courtyard beneath the shadow of the Antonia fortress. It was not a safe place physically. Debris rained down around them, but spiritually, it was a fortress. They shared what little food they had. They prayed, not for safety, but for courage. They confessed their fears. They confessed their resentments. As the fires of the Roman torches illuminated the night sky, a different fire burned in that courtyard. The love that had grown cold was being rekindled, fanatically and desperately. It was a defiant love. It was a love that said to the encroaching darkness, "You can take our city, you can take our lives, but you cannot take our care for one another." The final breach happened at dawn. The sound was like the earth cracking open. The Romans poured into the city, a river of iron and red cloaks. The screams of Jerusalem rose in a terrible chorus. Elias and the group knew they had to move. They had to try to reach the southern gates, which might still be open for refugees. They moved as a single unit. Silas carried the blind Bartimaeus on his back. Sarah carried the youngest child. Elias led the way, his eyes scanning the chaos. They reached a market square that was being overrun. Soldiers were looting the stalls, setting fire to the awnings. A group of people were trying to flee, but a cart had overturned, blocking their path. In the middle of the square, separated from her parents by the crushing crowd, a little girl stood crying. She was frozen in terror, staring at a horse rearing up above her. The rider, a Roman auxiliary, raised his spear, not in malice, but in the blind frenzy of battle. Elias saw her. The old logic, the logic of the cold days, flashed in his mind instantly. She is not one of us. If you run out there, you will be cut down. You have a responsibility to your group, and keep moving. It was a sensible thought. It was a rational thought. But Elias did not listen to it. He did not even break stride. He handed his water skin to Thomas and sprinted into the open square. "Elias!" Sarah screamed. He ran through the smoke. He threw himself between the horse and the girl just as the spear came down. He did not have a weapon. He had only his body. He shoved the girl hard, sending her rolling under the shelter of the overturned cart. The spear missed Elias's chest but grazed his shoulder, tearing through the tunic and flesh. The pain was blinding white heat. Elias fell, rolling in the dust. The horse trampled the ground inches from his head. The soldier, surprised by the sudden intervention, wheeled his horse around to strike again. But then a stone struck the soldier's helmet, then another. Silas had stepped out from the group, hurling debris at the rider, drawing his attention. "Run, Elias," Silas horrid. Elias scrambled up, ignoring the blood running down his arm. He grabbed the girl from under the cart. He ran back toward the alleyway where the group waited. They pulled him in. They pulled the girl in. They retreated into the labyrinth of the lower city. Elias leaned against a wall, gasping for air, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You idiot," Thomas said, but he was ripping a piece of his own tunic to bind Elias's wound. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Elias wheezed, looking at the little girl who was now being held by Sarah. He realized then what the teacher had meant by endurance. He who endures to the end will be saved. Endurance was not just surviving the timeline. Endurance was keeping the capacity to love alive until the very last moment. It was refusing to let the horror of the situation turn you into a monster. He had endured. He had risked his life for a stranger. The coldness was dead. He was in pain. He was bleeding. He was hunted. But he was fully, gloriously alive. Jerusalem fell. The temple burned, sending a pillar of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. The stones were thrown down, just as the teacher had said. But a week later, on a quiet hillside near the road to Pella, a group of refugees sat around a small fire. They were dirty. They were wounded. They had lost their homes, their possessions, and their city out to the world. They were nothing, just another band of displaced victims of the Roman war machine. But as Elias looked around the circle, he saw something else. He saw Silas, the traitor, breaking bread and serving it to Thomas, the doubter. He saw Sarah, the cynic, singing a lullaby to the orphan girl. He saw Bartimaeus, the blind man, laughing at a story told by Mary. They had nothing, yet they had everything. Elias sat back, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear in the twilight sky. His shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, a permanent reminder of the day he chose love over safety. He thought back to the prophecy on the Mount of Olives. The love of many will grow cold. It was true. He had seen it. He had seen neighbors betray neighbors. He had seen priests ignore the dying. He had felt the frost in his own veins. The world had indeed grown cold, cruel, and lawless. But the prophecy was not a curse upon everyone. It was a warning and a challenge. And they had met the challenge. They had wrestled with the numbness and won. They had discovered that love was not a feeling to be enjoyed in times of peace, but a fire to be guarded in times of storm. The teacher did not promise that we would save the city, Elias said softly, breaking the silence. The others looked at him. The firelight danced in their eyes. He promised that if we kept the love, we would save our souls, Elias continued. Look at us. We are the remnant. We are the proof that the cold does not win. Silas reached over and squeezed Elias's hand. The scar on Silas's thumb pressed against Elias's skin, a mark of their history, both the good and the bad. Where do we go from here? Sarah asked, looking out into the dark valley. We go forward, Elias said. We carry the fire. The world will always be cold, Sarah. There will always be Rome. There will always be betrayal. But as long as we hold on to this, he gestured to the circle, to the bread, to the shared wounds, then the light cannot be extinguished. They ate in silence, a holy communion in the wilderness. Behind them, the smoke of Jerusalem faded into the night. Ahead of them lay an uncertain future, but they were not afraid. They had learned the secret that the darkness could not comprehend. They knew that love, when tested by fire, does not turn to ash, it turns to gold. And so, in the shadow of a fallen empire, the love of the few remained burning, warm, and defiant, ready to begin again.